I have not a lot of words at the moment, to be honest. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. So, yeah, start of course is one problem that we have to fix. But then after that, the balance is of course all over the place. Probably the highest degradation of everyone out there, which is just uncontrollable. Plus, and some other bits on the car that were not, I would say well prepared. So, yeah, we just need to get our stuff together.
A few hours ago in China, something happened to Max Verstappen that almost never happens. A Red Bull car finished outside the points, not because of a crash, not because of strategy, but because the RB22 suddenly looked completely uncompetitive. 9th place for Verstappen, 15th for Hadjar, 0 points for Red Bull, and a gap of almost 2 seconds to Mercedes in qualifying. For a team that dominated Formula One for years, that is not just a bad result. That is a warning sign. But the real controversy started seconds after the sprint began. Because Verstappen's launch off the grid immediately triggered attention from race control. The FIA began reviewing the start. And suddenly the conversation in the paddock changed completely. Not just about the RB22's shocking lack of pace, but about whether Red Bull's start procedure could be facing further scrutiny. At the same time, Verstappen himself delivered one of the most brutal verdicts we have heard from him in years. No grip, no balance, and a car that simply does not respond to setup changes. Those are his words. Which raises a much bigger question. How did the most dominant team of the last era suddenly look like a midfield car in Shanghai? And more importantly, is this just a bad weekend? Or the first real sign that Red Bull's control of Formula One might finally be slipping away? Subscribe to the channel. Because what happened in the China sprint might only be the beginning of a much bigger story. The China sprint weekend did not start with the race. It actually started hours earlier, in sprint qualifying. And that is where the first alarm bells began to ring inside the Red Bull garage. Because when Max Verstappen stepped out of the car after the session, his reaction was unusually blunt. Not frustration, not disappointment. Something stronger. He called the situation a disaster. And when Verstappen uses that word, people in the paddock listen. Because he is not a driver who complains easily. Especially not publicly. But the numbers from that session were impossible to ignore. George Russell placed the Mercedes on pole position for the sprint, and the gap to Verstappen was enormous. Almost 2 full seconds by the time the final phase of qualifying ended. In modern Formula One, that kind of difference is shocking, especially between top teams. But the gap alone was not the real problem. The real problem was how the RB22 behaved on track. From the first laps in Shanghai, Verstappen kept repeating the same message over the radio. The rear of the car felt unstable. The car refused to rotate properly in the corners. And every time he tried to attack the entry of a turn, the confidence simply was not there. That is critical for a driver like Verstappen. Because his entire driving philosophy depends on committing early into the corner. He brakes late. He rotates the car aggressively. And he relies on a stable rear to carry speed through the apex. Without that stability, his biggest weapon disappears. And that is exactly what happened in China. The RB22 looked nervous, unpredictable, almost reluctant to cooperate with the driver, especially in the medium and high-speed corners. And Shanghai has plenty of those. The opening sequence of turns already exposes balance problems. A long, sweeping entry where the car needs perfect front grip and strong rear support. Then the massive corner that leads onto the back straight, one of the longest continuous corners in Formula One. If the car slides there, the lap time disappears instantly. And for Red Bull, that was happening every single lap. But here is the detail that made engineers inside the paddock even more concerned. The more grip the track gained during the session, the worse the RB22 seemed to perform. Normally, as rubber builds on the track surface, cars become faster and more stable. But Red Bull's lap times were not improving at the same rate as their rivals. Which suggests something deeper. A car that does not scale properly with increasing grip levels. That kind of behavior usually points to aerodynamic imbalance. Or an operating window that is simply too narrow. Meaning the car only works in very specific conditions. Temperature, ride height, tire preparation. If one of those variables moves slightly outside the ideal range, the performance collapses. And that appears to be exactly what happened in Shanghai. Even when Red Bull adjusted the setup. Even when Verstappen tried different approaches to the corners. The car never fully came alive. It remained difficult, unpredictable, and most importantly, slow. That is why Verstappen entered the sprint race already on the defensive, starting from 8th place on the grid, far away from the front row where Red Bull normally expects to be. But what nobody expected was that things were about to get even more complicated. Because seconds after the lights went out, the start of the race triggered a chain reaction that would eventually bring the FIA into the story. And that moment would turn an already bad weekend for Red Bull into something much more controversial. The lights went out in Shanghai. 5 red lights. Then darkness. And for a brief moment, everything looked normal. Cars launched. Engines screaming down the long straight. But within seconds, something unusual caught attention. Max Verstappen's launch. It was not the fastest start on the grid. It did not send him flying into the top positions. But the way the RB22 reacted off the line looked different. The car surged forward, then hesitated slightly before settling into acceleration. A small detail. So small that most viewers barely noticed it. But in modern Formula 1, every launch is monitored in extreme detail. Clutch engagement, torque delivery, engine mapping, wheel slip. Every millisecond is recorded. And if the data shows something outside expected parameters, race control automatically flags it for review. At first, it looked like a routine check. The kind that happens dozens of times during a season. But here is where the situation becomes interesting. Because the launch itself was not the only thing raising questions. What followed during the first laps made the situation even more strange. Despite the launch, despite the initial acceleration, Verstappen was not moving forward. He was falling backward. Cars behind began applying pressure almost immediately. DRS trains started forming. And instead of attacking the cars ahead, Verstappen was forced to defend. Lap after lap, corner after corner. The RB22 looked unstable, especially on corner entry. Every time Verstappen tried to rotate the car aggressively, the rear stepped out. That forced him to leave margin, brake earlier, accelerate more carefully. And when a driver like Verstappen has to drive cautiously, something is very wrong. Because his greatest advantage over the rest of the grid has always been commitment. He attacks corners harder than almost anyone else. But in China, that weapon disappeared. The car simply would not allow it. Meanwhile, the race at the front told a completely different story. Mercedes looked calm, controlled. George Russell managed the pace perfectly. Ferrari stayed within striking distance. McLaren remained consistently competitive. And Red Bull, the team that once dictated the rhythm of every race, was nowhere near that fight. Instead, Verstappen found himself trapped in what Formula 1 drivers hate the most: dirty air. Once you fall into the midfield pack, the entire race becomes a nightmare. Front tires overheat, aero balance collapses, and every attempt to attack destroys the tire life. That is exactly what happened to Verstappen. Even when a late safety car bunched the field together, Red Bull could not turn the situation into an advantage. Most teams used the moment to switch tires. Fresh rubber. One final attack for points. But when the race restarted, the RB22 still lacked the pace. Verstappen tried to defend his position, tried to attack the cars ahead, but the performance simply was not there. When the checkered flag finally dropped, the result confirmed the scale of the problem. 9th place, just one position outside the points. And for a driver used to winning races, finishing 9th feels almost like defeat. Behind him, the situation for Red Bull looked even worse. Isaac Hadjar had spent most of the sprint stuck in traffic after an early incident. His race never truly recovered. By the end of the sprint, he crossed the line in 15th place. 2 Red Bull cars. 0 points. And suddenly the conversation inside the paddock shifted. Because this was no longer about a bad setup. Or a single difficult circuit. Now people started asking a much more uncomfortable question. What if the RB22 simply is not fast enough? And this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because the problems Red Bull showed in China might not be isolated to this circuit. Some engineers believe the car's concept itself may be extremely sensitive. Too sensitive. A design that only works perfectly inside a very narrow window of conditions. Temperature, ride height, tire preparation, track grip. If any of those variables move slightly outside the ideal range, the car loses balance immediately. And Shanghai might have exposed exactly that weakness. But the paddock is also discussing another possibility. One that could be even more serious. Because if the RB22 truly has a correlation problem between simulation tools and real track behavior, then solving the issue becomes much harder, much slower. And that possibility changes the entire picture of the championship. Because while Red Bull tries to understand its car, Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren are already collecting points. Race after race. Weekend after weekend. Which raises the question nobody inside Red Bull wants to answer yet. Is this just a temporary setback? Or the beginning of a completely different competitive order in Formula 1? But the deeper story of the China sprint is not just the result, not even the FIA review. The real story is what the rest of the grid revealed that afternoon. Because while Red Bull struggled to stay inside the top 10, another team looked completely in control. Mercedes. George Russell did something in China that very few drivers manage during a sprint race. He controlled the entire event from start to finish. No panic. No tire collapse. No defensive chaos. Just clean pace. Clean execution. And another victory to start the season. That result was not just important for the race. It sent a message to the entire paddock. Mercedes might have found the right formula for the new generation of cars. And when that realization started spreading through the garages in Shanghai, the pressure on Red Bull increased immediately. Because Formula One never exists in isolation. A problem only becomes dangerous when someone else finds the solution. And right now, it looks like Mercedes might already have that solution. The balance of their car looked completely different from the RB22. Stable rear. Predictable corner entry. And most importantly, consistent tire behavior. Drivers often say a fast car is not just about peak speed. It is about confidence. A driver needs to trust that the car will behave the same way every lap. Russell had that confidence in China. Verstappen clearly did not. But Mercedes was not the only threat emerging. Ferrari also looked solid. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc stayed close enough to keep pressure on the leaders. And while they did not dominate the sprint, their car showed something extremely valuable. Consistency. No dramatic balance issues. No sudden tire collapse. Just stable performance across the entire race. That kind of stability becomes critical in a long championship. Because championships are not only won with victories. They are won with points every single weekend. Meanwhile, McLaren continues to build something very dangerous. A car that may not dominate every track, but almost always sits near the front. Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri once again finished inside the leading group. And the engineers in the paddock are beginning to say something interesting about the McLaren project. It might be the most balanced car on the grid. Not the fastest everywhere, but competitive almost everywhere. And in a season with more than 20 races, that balance becomes a powerful weapon. Now compare that to the situation Red Bull faced in Shanghai. A car that struggles in medium-speed corners. A rear end that refuses to stay stable. And an operating window so narrow that small setup changes seem to make little difference. Suddenly the hierarchy of Formula One looks very different from what fans were used to. For years, Red Bull set the pace. Other teams tried to catch them. Now, the roles may be reversing. And this is exactly why the mood inside the Red Bull garage after the sprint was unusually tense. Not dramatic. Not explosive. But tense. Because engineers understand something that fans sometimes forget. Performance gaps in Formula One can grow quickly. If a concept is wrong, fixing it can take months. New floors.